My hand froze on the rusted wheel of my grandfather's dam, knuckles white, while behind me Brenda Castle screamed for someone to stop me, her voice cracking over a lake that was disappearing by the second. Tourists in sundresses dropped their champagne flutes as the water line dropped 6 inches. Then a foot, exposing the muddy skeleton of a lake that had sold 100 cabins for $500,000 apiece. 3 months earlier, Brenda had told me my grandfather's deed was ancient nonsense nobody cared about. Today she would have traded every cabin in Briarwood Lake Estates to take those words back. My name is Marcus Webb, 41 years old, and the 11 acres along Cedar Hollow Creek in Pine Hollow, Georgia, have belonged to my family since 1968, when my grandfather Earl built the dam with his own 2 hands. My wife Renee teaches 3rd grade. My son Jordan is 12 and obsessed with catfish, and every Saturday morning we walk down to the pond behind the dam to fish exactly the way my grandfather taught me when I was Jordan's age. Next door, Briarwood Lake Estates had been growing for years, a gated community of beige houses with a homeowners association run by a woman named Brenda Castle, who treated every board meeting like a coronation. I'd met Brenda twice before any of this started. Both times at property line disputes over a drainage ditch, and both times she'd smiled at me the way people smile at something they plan to step over later. Briarwood's board announced Phase 2, the Hollow Cabins, 100 lakefront vacation rentals advertised with drone footage of water that, on the county map, sat partly on land my grandfather had owned for 56 years. Brenda stood at the podium calling it an unprecedented opportunity for generational wealth, and the crowd of homeowners clapped without once asking who actually held the deed to the water they were applauding. A surveyor named Pete Lindqvist showed up on my property with stakes and orange flags, and when I asked who authorized him, he just shrugged and said, "The HOA." Like that phrase alone settled property law. I called the county recorder's office and learned the official boundary map had been quietly amended 8 months earlier, shifting my northern line 40 feet inward, conveniently exactly where the cabins needed to go. When I brought the old county filing to Brenda's office, she barely glanced at it before saying the new survey supersedes outdated paperwork, as if my grandfather's signature meant less than a stamp from last spring. She had the disposition of someone used to winning arguments by simply repeating herself louder, and in our first real conversation she told me, almost cheerfully, that progress doesn't wait for sentimental attachments. I started keeping a folder, copies of everything. The 1968 deed, the dam's original county water permit, every email Brenda's office sent me, because something about her confidence felt less like ignorance and more like rehearsal. Renee noticed before I did how often Brenda's name came up at dinner, how the orange survey flags multiplied along our fence line week by week, creeping closer to the dam itself like a slow, deliberate tide. At a town hall, a man from the county planning office mentioned that Briarwood's expansion permits had been fast-tracked by Commissioner Hal Driscoll, a name I recognized from Brenda's campaign donor list the year before. I asked Pete Lindqvist directly whether his new survey matched the original county records, and for 1 second, just one, his confidence cracked before he recovered and insisted everything had been properly reviewed. Diane Pruitt, the HOA's vice president, pulled me aside after a meeting and quietly said, "Marcus, get a lawyer and get one before the groundbreaking," which struck me as an oddly specific warning from someone on Brenda's own board. I hired Camille Ortiz, a property attorney recommended by a coworker, and the first thing she said after reading my folder was, "This isn't a boundary dispute, Marcus. This is a land grab with a homeowners association logo on it." Camille filed a formal objection with the county, but Brenda's response letter, drafted by her own attorney Roger Voss, called my claim an attempt to obstruct a community improvement project benefiting 200 families. At the next HOA meeting, Brenda projected a slide of the proposed cabins reflected in a glassy lake, and beneath the photo, in small print, it said "Artist Rendering," a detail nobody in that excited crowd seemed to notice. I stood up and asked, calmly, whose water rights fed that lake in the rendering, and Brenda answered without missing a beat that the dam infrastructure would be incorporated into community amenities, as though my grandfather's dam were hers to incorporate. Jordan asked me one night if the new cabins meant we couldn't fish anymore, and I didn't have an honest answer, because for the first time in my life I genuinely didn't know if the pond would still be ours by summer. Camille dug through state archives and found the original 1968 water rights certificate, granted to Earl Webb by the county in exchange for maintaining flood control on the creek, a document Brenda's lawyers had apparently never bothered to search for. When I mentioned the certificate to Brenda directly, she actually laughed and said, "Marcus, that's a 60-year-old piece of paper. Nobody is going to stop 100-cabin development over your grandfather's hobby." Construction crews started clearing trees along the disputed 40 feet before the county had even ruled on our objection. Chainsaws running from sunrise, as if Brenda intended to make the dispute physically irrelevant before it reached a judge. I called the county again and was told, almost apologetically, that no stop work order has been issued, which meant Brenda's crews could keep cutting while my lawyer kept filing, a race I was clearly losing in real time. Renee found out from a neighbor that Briarwood had already started pre-selling hollow cabin units to out-of-state investors, marketing brochures promising private lakefront access to water that legally still belonged to my family. I drove past the construction site one evening and saw survey stakes planted less than 10 feet from the dam's control gate itself. And for the first time, the fear in my chest turned into something colder and more focused. That night I told Renee, "She doesn't know what that dam actually does." And Renee looked at me for a long moment before saying, "Then maybe it's time she finds out the hard way, Marcus, because the easy way clearly isn't working." The first real clash happened on a Tuesday morning when I found 3 of Brenda's contractors standing on my side of the fence, measuring the exact distance from the dam's spillway to where a footbridge was supposed to go. I asked them to leave, and instead one of them called Brenda directly, putting her on speakerphone, and her first words to me were, "Marcus, I need you to stop harassing my crew on community property," as if I were the trespasser. I told her flatly that nothing past my fence post was community property, and she replied, sweet as syrup, "We'll let the new survey speak for itself," then hung up before I could mention the certificate Camille had found. That afternoon, a no trespassing sign I'd nailed up that very morning was lying in the grass, pried off cleanly, and when I texted Diane Pruitt about it, she sent back a single line, "Get cameras up, now." I installed 2 trail cameras along the fence line, partly for evidence, partly because something about the speed of that sign's removal told me this fight wasn't going to stay polite for very long. At the next HOA general meeting, Brenda introduced me to the room as the homeowner currently delaying a project 200 families are counting on. And I watched dozens of strangers glare at me like I'd personally stolen their vacation. Camille stood up at that same meeting, calm as ever, and read aloud the date and certificate number of the 1968 water rights filing. And for one beautiful second the room went quiet enough to hear the air conditioning hum. Brenda recovered fast, smiling at the crowd and saying, "Our attorney is reviewing that document's validity," a phrase designed to sound responsible while meaning, in practice, absolutely nothing would change that night. Roger Voss, Brenda's lawyer, sent Camille a letter calling my continued presence near the construction zone a safety hazard, suggesting, politely but unmistakably, that I should stay off my own land during business hours. I laughed when Camille read me that letter over the phone, then stopped laughing when she said, "Marcus, this is the part where they start building a paper trail to make you look unreasonable before a judge ever sees this." 2 days later, a county code inspector showed up at my house responding to an anonymous complaint about unpermitted structures near the creek. Structures that turned out to be the same dam my family had maintained for 56 years. The inspector, a tired-looking man named Curtis, told me off the record that the complaint had come from an HOA address, and I didn't need him to say Brenda's name for me to understand exactly who'd made the call. Renee started keeping her own folder after that, screenshots of Briarwood's marketing posts showing the lake, dated the same week the code complaint landed on our porch. A timeline too neat to be coincidence. Jordan came home from school upset because a classmate, whose family had bought into the new cabins, told him, "Your dad is trying to ruin everyone's vacation house." And I realized this fight had already reached my 12-year-old. I went to a Briarwood community picnic that weekend, uninvited but determined to be visible, and Brenda greeted me in front of everyone with a hug I never asked for, whispering, "This would all go so much easier if you'd just sell." I told her the land wasn't for sale, and she stepped back, smile still fixed in place, and said loud enough for nearby families to hear, "Of course, everyone's entitled to their priorities, even at the community's expense." That phrase, "at the community's expense," followed me home and sat in my chest all night, because Brenda had a gift for making my refusal to be erased sound like selfishness, and 100 neighbors believed every word. Diane Pruitt called me privately that evening and said the board had voted, 3-2, to explore all options regarding my property. A vote she'd opposed and one Brenda had scheduled for a meeting I wasn't told about. I asked Camille what explore all options could legally mean, and she said the honest answer was eminent domain petitions, nuisance lawsuits, or simply enough legal pressure to make me too exhausted to keep fighting. The groundbreaking ceremony for the hollow cabins happened anyway, gold shovels and a brass band, Brenda's photo on the front of the county newspaper holding dirt from soil that, by the deed in my fire safe, was still mine. I stood at the edge of that ceremony with Camille's letter in my pocket, watching Brenda pose for pictures in front of survey stakes planted on disputed land, and understood she had decided to simply build faster than the law could catch her. That night, my trail camera caught footage of a man in a Briarwood-branded polo shirt opening the dam's outer maintenance gate, just enough to peer inside, then closing it and walking away like he'd been checking something specific. Camille filed an emergency motion for a restraining order against further construction within the disputed boundary, and for the first time, a judge actually scheduled a hearing instead of leaving it to county paperwork purgatory. Brenda's response, delivered through Roger Voss, accused me of weaponizing nostalgia to obstruct affordable family vacation housing. Language so absurd I almost laughed, until I remembered judges sometimes believe absurd things too. The hearing got postponed twice, both times by motions filed from Roger Voss's office, and each delay let another row of cabin foundations get poured closer to the dam's outer wall while my family waited for a court date. Brenda's marketing team launched a glossy campaign called Cedar Lake Living, renaming my family's pond without asking, slapping the new name on banners that hung from lampposts all the way down the county highway. I started getting calls at odd hours, hang-ups mostly, until one night a voice I didn't recognize said, "Some things just aren't worth fighting for, Marcus." Before the line went dead, and Renee insisted we change our number. Camille traced the threatening call's origin to a burner phone purchased at a gas station 2 miles from Briarwood's sales office. Evidence too thin for police but heavy enough to make sleep difficult in our house that week. A second code complaint arrived, this one claiming our dock violated setback regulations that had existed since before the dock did. And Curtis the inspector told me privately, "I keep getting these from the same general area, Marcus." Brenda hosted an investor preview weekend for the hollow cabins, complete with catered brunch on a deck overlooking the pond, and I watched from my porch as strangers in sunglasses photographed water my grandfather had dammed by hand. One investor, an older man named Frank, wandered over to my fence line during the preview and asked, genuinely curious, whether the lake access was fully secured, and I told him the honest truth, that legally, it wasn't secured at all. Frank's face changed, and he walked back toward the sales tent looking troubled, and within the hour Brenda herself came striding across the grass toward me, heels sinking into mud, fury barely contained behind a fixed smile. "You do not get to scare off my buyers," she hissed, low enough that nearby families couldn't hear, and I told her I'd simply answered a direct question honestly, which seemed to make her angrier than any lie could have. That same week, my employer, a general contracting firm where I'd worked for 9 years, mentioned losing a bid on a Briarwood subcontract, and my supervisor said offhand that someone on their board specifically requested we not be considered. Camille warned me this was exactly the pressure campaign she'd predicted. Financial squeeze layered on legal squeeze layered on public humiliation, designed not to win in court but to make surrender feel like the only sane option left. Renee started picking up substitute shifts after school to cushion the legal bills, and one night she said quietly, "I'm not scared of losing the land, Marcus. I'm scared of what it costs us to keep it," which I understood completely. The restraining order hearing finally happened, and the judge, a careful woman named Judge Alvarez, granted a partial injunction halting construction within 50 feet of the dam. Far less than we'd hoped, but something. Brenda's reaction to the ruling, posted on the HOA's community page, framed it as a minor procedural delay and reassured buyers that Phase 2 remains fully on schedule for summer opening, as if the judge's words carried no real weight. Construction simply shifted to the far side of the 50-foot line, cabins rising in neat rows visible from my back porch, close enough that I could hear nail guns firing every morning before Jordan even left for school. Diane Pruitt resigned abruptly from a board subcommittee, citing personal reasons, but the email she sent me privately afterwards said only, "I found something in the financial records. I need time to be sure before I show anyone." I asked Diane directly what she'd found, and she wouldn't say over text, insisting on meeting somewhere away from Briarwood entirely, which told me whatever she'd uncovered was serious enough to make her genuinely afraid. We met at a diner 2 towns over, and Diane slid a printed spreadsheet across the table showing HOA reserve funds, nearly $400,000, transferred into an account linked to a shell company called Castle Ventures LLC. Brenda's last name before she married was Castle, Diane said quietly, and I felt the floor tilt slightly, because suddenly the urgency behind the hollow cabins looked less like vision and more like desperation to refill a hole. Camille took the spreadsheet and said it wasn't enough on its own for fraud charges, but combined with the falsified survey, it painted a picture of someone who needed those 100 cabins sold fast, for reasons that had nothing to do with community. That night, I lay awake calculating something I hadn't let myself fully consider before. The dam wasn't just a boundary line. It was the actual water source feeding the lake those cabins were being sold on, and the rights to it were mine. I asked Camille, almost hesitantly, whether I had the legal authority to control water flow through the dam regardless of the boundary dispute, and she pulled the original 1968 permit and read the operating clause out loud, twice. "Earl Webb and his heirs," she read, "retain sole discretion over gate operation for flood control purposes," and looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, something between caution and quiet excitement. I didn't act on it yet, not because I lacked the right, but because some part of me still believed reasonable people, faced with the truth, would eventually choose to do the right thing without forcing my hand that far. Brenda, meanwhile, scheduled the official grand opening for the hollow cabins 3 months out, inviting a local news crew, county officials, and Commissioner Hal Driscoll himself to cut the ribbon in front of the stunning Cedar Lake. I watched the announcement video on the HOA's social page a dozen times, focusing on the drone shot of the full lake glittering behind 100 brand new rooflines. Water that existed entirely because my family chose to keep that gate open. A reporter named Tasha Reyes from the county paper reached out after hearing rumors about the boundary dispute, and Camille advised me to talk to her, calmly, with documents, building a record that existed outside Brenda's control. Tasha's first article ran with the headline "Land Dispute Clouds Briarwood's Big Opening," modest in tone, but it was the first time anyone outside our small circle had publicly questioned Brenda's version of events. Brenda's response to the article, quoted directly, called it "irresponsible journalism stirring up division in our community." And privately, according to Diane, she demanded the HOA's PR firm bury this before it spreads. A second code complaint arrived, absurdly claiming our home's roof color violated covenants that didn't even apply to properties outside Briarwood's gates. And Curtis the inspector finally said, off the record, "This one's not even real, Marcus." I started recording every interaction with HOA representatives after that. Every visit, every letter, every contractor who wandered too close to the fence, building a record thick enough that no judge could call it sentimental nostalgia. Jordan, sharper than I gave him credit for, asked me one evening, "Dad, if it's our water, why don't you just close it?" And I told him the truth, that I wasn't ready to be the villain in someone else's story. Not yet. Renee touched my arm and said, "You're not the villain for protecting what's ours, Marcus. You're just the only adult in this whole mess still trying to be fair." And something in that sentence settled a question I'd been avoiding. Diane warned me privately that Brenda had started pressuring board members to approve a formal eminent domain petition against my 11 acres, framing it as necessary infrastructure access for the cabin's water amenities. The petition would need a county vote, Camille explained, and while it likely wouldn't survive a real legal challenge, it could tie up my land in litigation for years, exactly long enough for the hollow cabins to sell out and Brenda to disappear with the proceeds. For 2 strange weeks, everything went quiet. No new complaints. No contractors near the fence. No calls from Roger Voss. A silence that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before something worse. Renee and I used the lull to finally clean out my grandfather's old workshop attached to the dam house. Boxes untouched since his funeral. Dust thick on tools he'd used to dig the original spillway by hand in 1968. In one box, wrapped in an oilcloth, I found his original handwritten journal from the dam's construction, page after page of measurements, county meeting notes, and a signed letter from the original commissioner thanking him for flood control. Jordan read parts of the journal aloud at the kitchen table, delighted by his great-grandfather's stubborn handwriting. And for one evening the hollow cabins, Brenda, and the whole mess felt very far away from our small, warm house. Camille called during the lull to say the eminent domain petition had stalled in committee, partly thanks to Tasha Reyes's reporting, and partly because 2 commissioners didn't want their names near something this publicly messy. I drove out to check on the dam itself during the quiet, oiling the main control wheel that hadn't been touched in years, surprised at how smoothly it still turned despite decades of weather and neglect. Diane texted that Brenda had been spending unusual amounts of time alone in the HOA office after hours, and that the hollow cabin's presale numbers, according to a leaked internal memo, were running well behind projections. Frank, the older investor from the preview weekend, called Camille's office directly, asking quietly whether he could get his deposit back, saying he'd heard things that made him uneasy about the project's legal footing. Camille told me Frank's call mattered more than he probably realized, because a paper trail of buyers having second thoughts before the dispute resolved would matter enormously if this ever reached a fraud investigation. Renee and I took Jordan fishing at the pond that Sunday, the water calm and full, and for a moment I let myself simply enjoy it without calculating leverage, lawsuits, or the cost of standing my ground. Then Diane called again, voice tight, to say Brenda had just announced the grand opening would move up 6 weeks, to beat both the slow sales numbers and any further legal complications, and the quiet officially ended. The announcement sent the HOA group chat into a frenzy of excitement. Owners trading congratulations over an opening date none of them knew was being rushed specifically to outrun a legal dispute over the water beneath their decks. Camille requested an emergency status conference, but the civil court calendar couldn't accommodate a hearing before the new opening date, leaving us 6 weeks to prepare without any fresh judicial protection in place. I called Diane and asked plainly whether the board had been told the real reason behind the rushed timeline, and she said no, only that Brenda described it as seizing momentum, a phrase that meant nothing and explained everything. Renee looked at the calendar taped to our fridge, 6 weeks circled in red, and said, "Then we stop reacting to her timeline, Marcus, and start building ours." And that night we called Camille back with a different kind of question. Camille's different question was simple. If the grand opening relied entirely on a full lake, what, precisely, under the 1968 permit, would happen if the gate's flow were legally adjusted before that day arrived? She explained that the permit allowed Earl Webb's heirs to manage flow for flood control or maintenance. A broad clause that, read carefully, gave me far more discretion than Brenda's lawyers had apparently ever bothered to research. I didn't want to act rashly, so Camille drafted a formal, certified letter to the HOA notifying them, in writing, that scheduled maintenance on the dam's spillway mechanism might require temporary water level adjustments in the coming weeks. Roger Voss's response dismissed the letter as an obvious attempt to manufacture leverage before our client's grand opening. Language that, ironically, confirmed in writing exactly how aware they were of how much that lake mattered. Brenda doubled down publicly instead of negotiating, posting on the community page that minor water fluctuations are normal and will not affect the stunning views our residents and guests will enjoy. A confident lie dressed as reassurance. Meanwhile, the hollow cabin's marketing accelerated. Billboards along the highway showing the drone shot of the full lake, captioned, 100 cabins. One unforgettable view. With a ticking countdown to the new opening date. Diane discovered that 31 of the 100 cabins remained unsold just 5 weeks before opening. Far below the nearly sold-out claim Brenda had been repeating at every board meeting and to every reporter who asked. To move inventory, Brenda authorized a founder's pricing event, slashing prices and offering free upgrades. An aggressive push that Camille noted publicly committed even more buyers' money to a property with an unresolved legal cloud over its main feature. Frank, the investor who'd called earlier asking about his deposit, went public with a brief comment to Tasha Reyes, saying he'd walked away from the project entirely after doing more homework on the water situation than the sales team wanted. Brenda's office issued a statement calling Frank a single disgruntled buyer with a personal grudge, conveniently ignoring that 2 other smaller deposits had quietly been refunded that same week for unspecified, personal reasons. I started noticing unfamiliar cars parked near our property line at odd hours, and my trail camera eventually caught a man photographing our house and the dam from a tripod set up just outside our fence at dusk. Camille identified the man through the camera's metadata timestamp cross-referenced with a private investigator's business filing. A man named Russ Kowalski, hired, according to county business records, by Castle Ventures LLC just 2 weeks earlier. Diane confirmed that Brenda had personally authorized a due diligence expense to Kowalski's firm, ostensibly for property research, though Diane suspected the real goal was finding something, anything, to discredit me before the opening. Kowalski's surveillance turned up nothing useful, because there was nothing to find, but the attempt itself became one more piece of evidence Camille filed showing a documented pattern of intimidation rather than legitimate business practice. At school, Jordan's classmate apologized unexpectedly, saying his own father had pulled their family's deposit after overhearing an HOA board meeting argument about some water rights thing nobody wanted to explain clearly. That small, unplanned confession from a 12-year-old told me more about cracks in Brenda's narrative than any official document had. Because children repeat what adults whisper, and Briarwood's adults were clearly whispering plenty. Commissioner Hal Driscoll's office, scheduled to attend the grand opening ribbon cutting, received Camille's certified maintenance letter as a courtesy copy, and within days his staff quietly asked Briarwood for additional documentation before confirming his attendance. Brenda reacted to Driscoll's hesitation by personally visiting his office, and according to a clerk Diane knew, left visibly agitated after a closed-door meeting that lasted barely 10 minutes. Diane's access to financial records deepened, and she found a second transfer from HOA reserves, this one nearly $150,000, routed through Castle Ventures to an account matching Brenda's personal mortgage lender. She's using HOA money to keep her own house, Diane told me, voice shaking slightly over the phone, and the cabins were supposed to refill the reserves before anyone on the board noticed the hole. Camille said this new information, combined with the falsified survey and the surveillance attempt, was edging close to something a county prosecutor might actually take seriously, but warned that complex fraud cases could drag on for years without a triggering event. I asked her plainly what kind of triggering event she meant, and she said, almost gently, something public enough and undeniable enough that nobody can look away or quietly settle it behind closed doors anymore. Renee overheard that conversation and later asked me directly whether I was finally considering the gate, and I told her honestly that I was not out of revenge, but because waiting politely clearly wasn't protecting anyone. Camille drew up a precise legal plan. A second, unambiguous maintenance notice with a specific date, giving Briarwood official, documented warning that water levels would be adjusted, timed deliberately close to the grand opening itself. This isn't sabotage, Camille said, sliding the draft across her desk. This is you exercising a documented legal right, with full written notice, while she exercises her documented habit of ignoring warnings she finds inconvenient. We sent the second notice 4 weeks before the grand opening, specifying that essential spillway maintenance, required for flood safety, would necessitate lowering the reservoir for inspection sometime in the coming weeks. Roger Voss responded within hours, threatening an emergency injunction against any water level changes, calling it deliberate economic sabotage timed to damage a community celebration. A phrase Camille happily quoted back in her own filing. Judge Alvarez's clerk scheduled an emergency hearing for the injunction request just 9 days before the grand opening, which meant, for better or worse, this fight was finally heading somewhere a judge would have to actually decide. Brenda, perhaps sensing the ground shifting, tried a different approach entirely, showing up at my house unannounced on a Sunday afternoon with a folder of paperwork and an expression I hadn't seen from her before: genuine worry. "What if we just bought the 11 acres outright?" she said, sliding a number across my porch railing that was, admittedly generous. No lawsuits, no hearing, everyone walks away happy. As though happiness were something money alone could manufacture. I told her the land wasn't for sale, the same answer I'd given months earlier, and watched something in her composure finally crack, just slightly, around the edges of that practiced smile. "You don't understand what's riding on this," she said quietly, almost to herself, before catching herself and rebuilding the smile. But Renee, watching from the doorway, heard it too, and we both knew exactly what it meant. At the emergency hearing, Camille presented the 1968 permit's operating clause, the maintenance notices, and Diane's financial records as context for why the dispute had escalated beyond a simple property line disagreement. Roger Voss argued that any water adjustment, regardless of legal right, constituted tortious interference with a multimillion-dollar business event, a creative legal theory that Judge Alvarez listened to with visible, unimpressed patience. Judge Alvarez ultimately denied Briarwood's injunction, ruling that Marcus Webb, as documented heir to the original water rights permit, retained lawful authority over spillway operations, including routine maintenance adjustments, with proper notice given. The ruling didn't order me to do anything, it simply confirmed I had every right to, and Camille said afterward with quiet satisfaction, "Now it's entirely your decision, Marcus, exactly the way it always should have been." Brenda's PR team scrambled to control the narrative, releasing a statement that minor maintenance is expected on all infrastructure and will not impact our incredible grand opening celebration. Confidence that felt thinner with every word. Tasha Reyes's follow-up article, headlined "Judge Confirms Local Families' Water Rights Ahead of Briarwood Opening," ran above the fold, and for the first time, public opinion in the county started visibly shifting away from Brenda's version of events. HOA group chat screenshots Diane forwarded me showed homeowners, for the first time, asking pointed questions. "Wait, whose water is this actually? And why didn't the board mention any lawsuit before we signed contracts?" Brenda called an emergency board meeting to address community concerns, but according to Diane, spent most of it insisting the legal situation was fully under control, while refusing to answer a single specific question about the Castle Ventures transfers. 2 more cabin deposits were quietly refunded that week, and a third buyer publicly posted online, tagging the HOA demanding clarity on whether this lake is even legally guaranteed to exist past opening weekend. Commissioner Driscoll's office formally declined to attend the grand opening, citing scheduling conflicts, a transparent excuse that Diane said sent Brenda into a closed-door rage loud enough that the office assistant heard shouting through the walls. Kowalski, the private investigator, resurfaced unexpectedly, calling Camille's office directly to say he wanted no further involvement, mentioning he'd been paid less than half of what was promised and suspected Brenda's accounts were running dry. Camille convinced Kowalski to provide a written statement detailing exactly what he'd been hired to find and how he'd been paid, evidence that, combined with Diane's financial records, painted an increasingly complete picture of fraud. I asked Camille what would happen to the 100 cabins, the buyers, the families who genuinely just wanted a vacation home, and she said honestly, "That depends entirely on how loudly the truth comes out and when." Renee suggested carefully that maybe the goal shouldn't be punishing Brenda for its own sake, but making sure the truth came out clearly enough that nobody mistook honesty for spite when this finally ended. With 3 weeks left before the grand opening, Brenda launched one final marketing push, a televised local news segment filmed at the lake, smiling beside the very water whose legal future a judge had just confirmed wasn't fully hers to promise. The segment aired the same week Tasha Reyes published a deeper investigative piece tracing the Castle Ventures transfers, the falsified survey, and Kowalski's statement into one connected timeline, finally visible to anyone willing to read it. HOA membership, for the first time in the dispute's history, formally requested an independent financial audit of the association's reserve accounts, a motion Diane had quietly been gathering signatures for over the previous month. Brenda fought the audit request furiously at the next meeting, calling it an unnecessary distraction orchestrated by people who want to see this community fail. But the vote passed anyway, 18-11, the first real defeat of her presidency. With the audit scheduled and public scrutiny rising, Camille advised that the timing for any maintenance adjustment to the dam mattered enormously now, both legally and in terms of how clearly the public would understand why it happened. We decided, deliberately, not to act before the grand opening, letting Brenda walk fully, publicly, into the celebration she'd built her entire reputation on, with every legal right to lower the water still sitting quietly in my hands. 2 weeks out, Diane warned me that desperation was making Brenda unpredictable, and that I should expect her to try something neither of us had anticipated before this was finally over. Diane's warning proved right within days, when a county utility crew, hired directly by Castle Ventures rather than through any official permit process, arrived at the dam claiming authorization to inspect shared infrastructure. I refused them entry, citing the original permit's exclusive authority clause, and the crew foreman admitted, almost apologetically, that his work order simply said Castle Ventures property, with no mention of my family's deed at all. That night, my trail camera caught 2 men in dark clothing approaching the dam's outer gate around 2 in the morning, working at the lock mechanism with tools before a motion light startled them into running. Camille filed an emergency police report immediately, and the footage, time-stamped and clear, showed enough detail that the sheriff's department opened an active criminal investigation into attempted tampering with regulated water infrastructure. One of the men, identified through a license plate caught on a neighbor's doorbell camera, turned out to be a maintenance contractor previously employed directly by Briarwood's HOA office for routine landscaping work. Brenda denied any knowledge of the attempted gate tampering, calling it deeply concerning vandalism and offering, with theatrical concern, to help fund additional security cameras around shared community infrastructure, a phrase that made my skin crawl. Diane, however, found a text exchange on a board member's forwarded email thread referencing handling the maintenance issue before the opening, sent from Brenda's account to the contractor's personal number 2 days before the attempted break-in. Camille submitted that email thread directly to the sheriff's investigator, and within 48 hours, the contractor agreed to cooperate, stating Brenda had personally instructed him to see if the gate could just be jammed open quietly. News of an active criminal investigation into the HOA president spread through Briarwood faster than any marketing campaign ever had, and the group chat Diane monitored shifted overnight from excitement to open panic among homeowners. Brenda, cornered publicly for the first time, gave an interview to a different local station insisting the entire situation was a coordinated smear campaign by a bitter neighbor who never wanted this community to succeed, her composure visibly fraying on camera. Renee watched that interview with me in silence, then said quietly, "She's not lying to us anymore, Marcus. She's lying to herself, and that's usually what people do right before everything falls apart completely." With 10 days left before the grand opening, Roger Voss quietly filed paperwork withdrawing as Brenda's attorney, citing in a brief court notice irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy, legal language for refusing to drown alongside a sinking client. Brenda, without her primary attorney and facing a criminal investigation, doubled down rather than retreating, personally calling an emergency press conference to announce the grand opening would proceed exactly as planned, bigger than ever. She unveiled a new banner at the construction site reading, "Cedar Lake, a community triumph," and stood for photos in front of the full reservoir, smiling at cameras with an intensity that Tasha Reyes later described as unsettling rather than reassuring. Diane discovered, through a frantic late-night call from another board member, that Brenda had personally signed a new, smaller loan against the HOA's remaining reserves specifically to cover legal fees for her now separate criminal defense. That loan, totaling $60,000, brought the documented reserve shortfall close to $600,000, an amount Diane said would bankrupt the association entirely if this isn't unwound very, very carefully. Commissioner Driscoll, sensing political exposure, issued a public statement distancing himself from any individual under active investigation, conveniently omitting his earlier fast-tracking of the Hollow Cabin's original construction permits. With 7 days remaining, 3 more board members, citing personal and ethical concerns, resigned simultaneously, leaving Brenda presiding over a skeleton committee desperately trying to keep the grand opening from collapsing entirely. I received a final letter, not from any lawyer but handwritten, slipped into our mailbox from Brenda herself, asking to meet one last time, just us, no attorneys, before the opening. Renee was against it at first, worried it was another manipulation attempt, but Camille suggested I go anyway with a recorder running, because by this point everything Brenda said on record only strengthened our position. We met at the dam itself at her request, standing on opposite sides of the same gate her contractor had tried to jam open weeks earlier, water moving steadily between us like the only honest thing left in the conversation. "I built this community from nothing," she said, voice tight, "and you're going to let one piece of paper from 1968 erase everything I worked for." Genuine grief beneath the anger for the first time I'd seen. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that the paper hadn't erased anything. Her own choices had, the falsified survey, the borrowed reserves, the men sent to tamper with a gate that was never legally hers. She didn't deny any of it directly, which felt like its own kind of confession, and instead asked simply, "What happens now?" With none of the performance left in her voice, just exhaustion. I told her honestly that what happened next depended on whether she finally told the truth publicly, to her own board, before the opening, rather than letting 100 families discover it standing in front of an empty lake. She didn't answer that night, just turned and walked back toward Briarwood's lights, and I stood at the dam long after she'd gone, hand resting on the same will my grandfather had installed 58 years earlier. 5 days before the opening, instead of confessing anything, Brenda escalated again, quietly hiring a new attorney to file an emergency motion claiming the dam itself posed imminent flood risk, requiring immediate county takeover under emergency powers. Camille called the filing desperate and legally hollow, noting that no flood engineer had ever inspected the dam, and within a day, the county's own infrastructure office declined to act without an actual safety assessment. That denial became public record within hours, and Tasha Reyes's headline, HOA President's Emergency Flood Claim Rejected Amid Fraud Probe, ran on the same page as updates on the ongoing criminal investigation. Diane forwarded me screenshots of homeowners openly demanding Brenda's resignation in the group chat now. Words like embarrassing and we trusted her appearing in messages from people who'd applauded her at every meeting just months earlier. 3 days before opening, the independent financial audit's preliminary findings leaked, confirming Diane's numbers almost exactly. Nearly $600,000 missing from reserves, traced through Castle Ventures into Brenda's personal accounts. Brenda's response was a defiant social media post insisting the audit was incomplete and politically motivated, vowing the grand opening would happen no matter who tries to stop it. Language that read less like confidence and more like panic. I asked Camille one final time whether closing the gate during the opening, rather than quietly beforehand, was wise, worried it would look like cruelty rather than justice, and she said, "Marcus, by now, the truth doesn't need theater, but it deserves witnesses." Renee agreed, pointing out that if the gate closed quietly the week before, Brenda could spin an empty lake as unrelated maintenance. But if it happened in front of cameras during her own celebration, no spin would survive contact with reality. Jordan, listening from the kitchen doorway, said simply, "Dad, you've been fair this whole time," and she still tried to break the gate at 2 in the morning, so I don't think fair means quiet anymore. 2 days before opening, the sheriff's department confirmed formal fraud and conspiracy charges were being prepared against Brenda Castle. Pending finalization, news that somehow still hadn't stopped invitations from going out for the celebration itself. Brenda, perhaps believing a triumphant public moment could still rescue her image even amid criminal charges, refused every suggestion from her remaining allies to postpone, insisting the community deserves to see this finished. Diane resigned from the board entirely the night before the opening, unable to stomach attending, but promised to be there anyway, as a witness, not a board member, because everyone deserves to see how this actually ends. I spent that last night before the opening at the dam with my grandfather's journal open on my lap, rereading his careful handwriting about flood control and responsibility, and understood, finally, exactly what I needed to do. Renee packed a small bag for Jordan to bring a folding chair. "Front row seats," she said, only half joking, and I realized my entire family intended to stand beside me when this finally came to a head. Camille sent one final certified notice that morning, formally confirming scheduled spillway maintenance would commence during daylight hours. A notice Roger Voss's replacement attorney apparently never even bothered forwarding to Brenda in the chaos. By sunrise on opening day, banners lined Briarwood's entrance. A brass band tuned up near the lake, and 100 cabins gleamed in fresh paint, all of it resting, quite literally, on water I had every legal right to release. I drove to the dam that morning with Camille's certified letter in my glove compartment, Renee beside me, Jordan in the back seat with his folding chair, none of us speaking much, all of us braced for whatever came next. Briarwood's entrance looked like a county fair, food trucks lining the road, a banner reading Cedar Lake Grand Opening, stretched between 2 stone pillars, families in sundresses and polo shirts streaming toward the lake. Diane met us near the parking area, dressed plainly, no HOA badge for the first time in years, and said quietly, "She's already at the podium rehearsing her speech, like none of the last 6 months happened." Tasha Reyes spotted us and nodded once, professionally neutral, her camera already recording B-roll of the crowd, the cabins, the lake, footage that would matter enormously by the end of the afternoon. A sheriff's deputy I recognized from the gate tampering investigation stood near the refreshment tent, Not in uniform, just present, and Camille later admitted she'd quietly informed the department of today's timeline as a precaution. Brenda's new attorney approached us briefly, polite but clearly anxious, asking if there was any way to discuss timing. And Camille replied simply, "The notice already specified daylight hours. This is daylight." Jordan set up his folding chair near the water's edge, close enough to see the spillway gate clearly, and said with the blunt honesty only a 12-year-old can manage, "This feels like the end of a movie." I walked the perimeter of the lake one last time before the ceremony, watching families take photos in front of water that existed because my grandfather built something with his hands 60 years ago for reasons that had nothing to do with profit. Commissioner Driscoll, despite his earlier statement distancing himself, showed up anyway at the last minute, perhaps unable to resist the optics of a ribbon cutting, standing awkwardly near the podium while reporters watched his every move. The brass band started playing a cheerful, slightly off-key tune, and Brenda emerged from a white tent looking polished and confident. A version of composure I knew by now was mostly costume. She climbed the small stage overlooking the lake, microphone in hand, and the crowd, still mostly unaware of the fraud charges quietly working their way through the sheriff's office, applauded warmly, genuinely happy to be there. 6 years ago, she began, voice steady, practiced. I had a vision for this community, a vision of growth, beauty, and opportunity for every family who calls Briarwood home. And the crowd clapped again, exactly as rehearsed. I stood near the back with Renee, Jordan beside us, Camille's letter folded in my jacket pocket, watching dozens of families who had no idea they were standing on the edge of a story about to end very differently than advertised. Brenda gestured toward the lake behind her, sunlight catching the water just right, and said, "This view, this lake, this is what made the Hollow Cabins the fastest-selling development in county history." A claim Diane had already disproven with hard numbers. A few buyers near the front, the ones who'd seen Tasha's articles, exchanged uneasy glances, but most of the crowd simply smiled, swept along by confetti cannons being readied near the stage for the ribbon cutting. Commissioner Driscoll was handed oversized scissors for the ceremonial ribbon, and Brenda turned to face the cabins, beaming, clearly believing the next 60 seconds would finally, permanently silence every question raised over the past 6 months. I felt Renee's hand find mine, steady and certain, and Camille caught my eye from a few feet away, nodding once, the smallest possible signal that everything legally necessary had already been done, properly in writing in daylight. The brass band swelled louder, building toward the ribbon cutting, and somewhere behind the stage, a Briarwood employee began uncorking bottles for a champagne toast meant to celebrate water that, within minutes, would no longer fully be there. I thought, standing there, about every no I'd given Brenda over 6 months, every offer to buy me out, every threat disguised as concern, and realized none of it had ever once included an apology, only pressure dressed as persuasion. Jordan tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Dad, is now?" And I looked at the spillway gate 50 yards away, then at the crowd still smiling, still unaware, and told him, almost, "Son, let her cut the ribbon first." Diane whispered that the audit's final report had just been emailed to every board member that very morning, meaning somewhere in that crowd, people were about to start checking their phones at the worst possible moment. Commissioner Driscoll raised the scissors theatrically. The band hit its final flourish, and Brenda announced, "Without further delay, I am thrilled to officially open Cedar Lake and the Hollow Cabins to the world," practically glowing with relief. The ribbon snapped cleanly, confetti cannons fired, applause erupted, and for exactly 4 seconds, Brenda Castle looked, for the first time in months, like a woman who genuinely believed she had one. Then phones in the crowd began lighting up almost simultaneously, board members reading the leaked audit email, murmurs rippling backward through the applause like a second, quieter wave following the first. I started walking toward the spillway gate, Camille beside me holding the certified notice visibly, Renee and Jordan following at a respectful distance, while Tasha Reyes's camera swung instinctively to track the movement. Brenda noticed me crossing the lawn before most of the crowd did, her smile faltering for the first time all afternoon, and called out, too loudly, "Marcus, this really isn't the time." Confetti still drifting around her shoulders. "It's daylight hours, exactly as noticed," Camille said clearly, holding up the certified letter for anyone nearby to see. Scheduled spillway maintenance, fully within Mr. Webb's documented legal authority under the 1968 permit. A small crowd began drifting toward the spillway out of confusion as much as curiosity, sensing something more interesting than another speech was unfolding. Phones turning away from the ribbon and toward us instead. Brenda hurried down from the stage, heels sinking slightly into the grass, calling for security, for her new attorney, for anyone to handle this. But the deputy near the refreshment tent simply watched, having already been briefed. "You can't do this in front of everyone," she said, finally reaching me, voice cracking between fury and panic, and I told her quietly, "You scheduled the everyone, Brenda. I just scheduled the maintenance." I reached the gate housing, Camille's documentation in hand, the sheriff's deputy now standing nearby, not to stop me, but simply to ensure nothing escalated past words, exactly as Camille had carefully arranged. The crowd, sensing genuine drama rather than ceremony, pressed closer, dozens of phones now recording, Tasha Reyes positioned perfectly to capture both Brenda's expression and the gate itself in the same frame. I placed my hand on the same rusted wheel my grandfather had turned decades earlier, took one breath, and began to turn it, slow and deliberate, while Brenda's voice rose behind me into something close to a scream. The wheel groaned, resistant after years of disuse despite my earlier oiling, and with each quarter turn I felt the mechanism release, water beginning to pull downward through the spillway with a low, steady rush. Brenda lunged forward, grabbing for my arm, shouting, stop it right now." And the deputy stepped between us calmly, saying only, "Ma'am, step back. He's not violating anything." Words that landed like a verdict. The crowd's confetti-streaked excitement curdled into stunned silence as the water level near the shoreline visibly began dropping. An inch, then two, the first muddy ring of lakebed appearing along the edges within minutes. A buyer near the front, phone raised, said loudly enough for nearby microphones to catch, "Wait, is the lake actually draining right now during the opening?" And several reporters' cameras swung instantly toward the widening mud ring. Brenda turned to the crowd, arms raised, voice strained, insisting, "This is sabotage. This is illegal sabotage by a bitter neighbor." But Camille, standing calmly beside me, simply held up the certified notice toward the nearest camera. "This notice was filed with the county and delivered to Briarwood's legal office 4 weeks ago," Camille said clearly, loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Scheduled, documented, and legally authorized under a permit older than this development." Commissioner Driscoll, still holding the oversized scissors, looked between Brenda and the receding water with visible alarm, clearly calculating how quickly he could distance himself from photographs that would outlive this particular afternoon. The water continued dropping steadily, exposing the muddy shoreline in widening rings, and the first cracks of dry, sun-baked lakebed from years past became visible beneath what had been advertised, just hours earlier, as a permanent feature. Families who just purchased lakefront cabins began walking toward their own decks in confusion, watching the promised view recede in real time, several pulling out purchase brochures to compare against what they were now actually seeing. One woman, clutching a folder of closing documents, approached Brenda directly and asked, voice shaking, "You told us this lake was permanent, guaranteed. That's literally in our contract." And Brenda had no answer that didn't sound like an admission. Tasha Reyes, recording everything, Asked Brenda on camera whether she'd known about the water rights dispute before selling lakefront units. And Brenda's hesitation, just 2 full seconds of silence, said more than any answer could have. I knew there was a boundary disagreement, Brenda finally said, visibly rattled. But I believed it would be resolved favorably. A sentence that, replayed later that evening on local news, effectively ended any remaining public sympathy for her. The deputy's radio crackled, and within minutes 2 more patrol cars arrived, not for me, but in response to a flood of nervous calls from buyers demanding to know whether their multimillion-dollar purchases had just become worthless. Diane stepped forward then, in front of cameras, identifying herself as a former board member, and said plainly, I have documentation showing HOA reserve funds were misappropriated to fund this project. The county audit confirms it. Gasps rippled through the crowd, confetti still clinging to shoulders and hair. As Diane's words landed alongside the visibly draining lake, 2 simultaneous collapses, one financial, one literal, happening in front of dozens of recording phones. Brenda's new attorney, visibly pale, pulled her aside, whispering urgently, but she shook him off, climbing back onto the stage, microphone in hand, attempting one final, desperate pivot toward damage control in front of an audience no longer applauding. This man, she said, pointing at me across the lawn, would rather destroy a community's dream than accept fair compensation for his land. But her voice cracked on fair, and somewhere in the crowd, someone actually laughed bitterly. A buyer shouted back from the crowd, You took our deposits knowing this could happen. And within seconds others joined in, a chorus of furious questions replacing the earlier applause entirely, drowning out whatever speech Brenda had planned next. I stood at the gate, hands still resting on the now stilled wheel, watching water continue its slow retreat, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet, steady relief that the truth was finally louder than her voice. Renee found my hand again, and Jordan stood close beside us, watching the chaos unfold with wide eyes, eventually saying quietly, I didn't think it would actually look like this. And I told him, Truth rarely looks clean, son. It just looks real. Commissioner Driscoll quietly set down the scissors on a folding table and walked briskly toward his car, declining every reporter's question along the way. His earlier statement distancing himself from Brenda suddenly looking remarkably well-timed. The county's infrastructure office, alerted by the visible draining and the growing crowd, dispatched an emergency engineer to confirm the spillway operation was within legal and safety parameters, which it was, exactly as Camille's documentation showed. Brenda, abandoned now by her attorney, by Driscoll, by the board members who'd resigned, stood alone on the stage as buyers, reporters, and former supporters formed a loose, furious semicircle demanding answers she clearly didn't have. A second buyer, an older woman, asked the question that seemed to hang over everyone present. Where exactly did our deposit money go, if it didn't go toward the lake we were promised? And Brenda's silence answered louder than words. Diane handed printed copies of the audit summary to several nearby buyers and reporters, copies she'd prepared in advance precisely for a moment like this. And within minutes, phones were photographing financial records instead of confetti. I watched Brenda's expression shift through several stages, defiance, panic, something close to genuine grief, before finally settling into a kind of hollow, exhausted stillness, the costume of confidence finally, completely gone. The sheriff's deputies, now joined by 2 additional officers, approached the stage calmly, one of them speaking quietly with Brenda for several minutes while the crowd watched. Recording, waiting, the celebration entirely transformed into something else. Camille, beside me, said quietly, The fraud charges were already in process before today, Marcus. This just made sure nobody could pretend they hadn't seen the truth with their own eyes. Tasha Reyes, still recording, asked me directly, on camera, why I'd chosen this exact moment to close the gate, and I answered simply, I gave 6 months of warnings to people who only listened when warnings stopped being private. A young couple near the dried shoreline, holding hands, asked me quietly if there was any chance the lake would return once the legal situation resolved, and I told them honestly, that depends on whether anyone here still wants to be honest with me. Jordan asked, watching the officers near Brenda, is she going to jail? And I told him the truth, that I didn't know exactly what would happen next, only that for the first time, the truth was finally in a position to decide instead of her. The brass band, awkwardly, had stopped playing entirely, instruments lowered, musicians simply watching the unfolding scene like everyone else, confetti settling slowly onto grass that, an hour earlier, had felt like the start of a celebration. One of the sheriff's deputies confirmed quietly to Camille that, given the gathered evidence and today's public admissions, Brenda would be asked to accompany officers downtown for further questioning once the immediate situation calmed. Brenda's last public words that day, captured clearly on 3 separate phone cameras, were, "I just wanted to build something that mattered." A sentence that, stripped of everything else, was probably the only fully honest thing she'd said all afternoon. As officers escorted her gently but firmly toward a patrol car, several buyers called out demands for refunds, lawyers' names, explanations, while others simply stood in stunned silence near decks overlooking water that no longer matched any brochure. I stayed by the gate a while longer, watching the muddy shoreline widen in the afternoon light, Renee's hand still in mine, Jordan's folding chair empty beside us as he wandered closer to watch the last of the drama settle. Within 48 hours, the county prosecutor's office formally charged Brenda Castle with fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit property tampering, charges built directly on Diane's records, Kowalski's statement, and the contractor's confession. The full financial audit, released publicly that same week, confirmed nearly $640,000 missing from HOA reserves, the majority funneled through Castle Ventures into personal mortgage payments and legal defense costs. Pete Lindqvist, the surveyor, facing his own professional licensing investigation, admitted under questioning that Brenda had paid him directly to adjust the boundary survey, falsifying the document that had started the entire dispute. The county officially voided the falsified survey, restoring the original 1968 boundary lines, which meant the 40 contested feet, including the land beneath several cabin foundations, legally belonged to my family after all. Briarwood's remaining board members, with Diane reluctantly returning to help stabilize the association, voted unanimously to remove Brenda permanently from any HOA position and began the painful process of addressing the financial shortfall. Several buyers filed civil lawsuits directly against Brenda Castle personally, citing fraudulent misrepresentation of the lake's permanence. Lawsuits Camille noted would likely consume whatever personal assets the criminal restitution process didn't already claim. Commissioner Hal Driscoll, despite his last-minute distancing, faced his own ethics inquiry after records surfaced showing he'd accepted campaign contributions from Castle Ventures around the same time he'd fast-tracked the original construction permits. Tasha Reyes's continuing coverage won regional recognition for investigative journalism. Her articles cited directly in both the criminal case and the civil lawsuits as some of the earliest public documentation of the unfolding fraud. Camille negotiated a settlement on my behalf regarding the cabin foundations built on the restored 40 feet, granting affected buyers a fair easement rather than demolition. A resolution, she said, reflected what Marcus actually wanted, which was never destruction. I sat down personally with several of the affected buyers, including the woman who'd confronted Brenda about her contract, and we worked out, family to family, an arrangement that let them keep their cabins while finally respecting the real boundary. Frank, the investor who'd first raised concerns, sent a brief note through Camille's office simply thanking me for being honest when honesty clearly cost you something. A sentiment that meant more than any settlement check ever could. Diane was elected the new HOA president in a landslide vote, her first official act establishing transparent financial reporting requirements that several homeowners openly admitted should have existed years before any of this happened. Brenda's criminal case moved through pre-trial proceedings over the following months, her new attorney eventually negotiating a plea agreement covering the embezzlement and fraud charges in exchange for cooperation regarding the gate tampering conspiracy. The contractor who'd attempted to tamper with the dam's gate testified that Brenda had explicitly instructed him to make it look like an accident, testimony that closed any remaining doubt about how far she'd been willing to go. Sentencing ultimately included restitution exceeding $600,000, supervised probation, and a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board within the state, a fall as public as her rise had been. Her home, the very mortgage the embezzled funds had secretly protected, ultimately went into foreclosure during the restitution process, an irony Diane mentioned once, quietly, without any satisfaction in her voice at all. The Hollow Cabins, rebranded simply as Cedar Hollow Cottages, reopened months later under new, transparent ownership, with the dam's water levels managed jointly through a formal agreement that finally, properly, acknowledged my family's original rights. Renee framed a copy of Judge Alvarez's ruling alongside my grandfather's original 1968 permit, hanging both in our living room, calling it proof that paperwork done right eventually outlasts people who think they're above it. Jordan, months later, told a school project audience proudly that his family had saved a lake by closing it first. A slightly garbled but fundamentally accurate summary of everything that had happened that spring. I ran into Brenda only once more, by accident, at the county courthouse during a restitution hearing, and she simply nodded at me, the first gesture between us in 18 months that wasn't laced with calculation. Diane and the rebuilt HOA board invited my family to the cottage's quiet reopening, an invitation I accepted, partly for Jordan's sake, and partly because watching that water return felt like something worth witnessing honestly. Tasha Reyes published one final retrospective piece, tracing the entire saga from the first survey stake to the courthouse sentencing, closing with a line about how the truth, however slowly, had eventually outlasted every attempt to bury it. County officials, in a small but meaningful gesture, officially renamed the reservoir Earl Webb Lake, honoring the man whose handwritten 1968 permit had quietly outlasted every lie built on top of it. Life in Pine Hollow settled slowly back into something ordinary. Renee returning fully to her classroom, Jordan back to chasing catfish along banks that were, once again, simply ours without lawyers or surveyors attached. Diane's transparent leadership rebuilt the HOA's reserves gradually, and several former Briarwood residents, once openly hostile toward me, eventually stopped by personally to apologize for believing Brenda's version of events for so long. Camille and I stayed in occasional contact long after the case closed, and she told me once that out of every property dispute she'd handled, mine was the only one where the client never once asked her to be cruel. The dam itself underwent a small, respectful renovation, funded partly by the new ownership group, modernizing the gate mechanism while preserving my grandfather's original spillway design exactly as he'd built it in 1968. Frank eventually bought a different cabin, fully transparent this time about every legal detail, and joked once that he'd learned more about water rights law than any vacation home should require. On the anniversary of that grand opening, our family returned to the dam quietly, just the three of us, watching the water move steadily through a gate that finally, fully, belonged to the people who'd always cared for it honestly. Jordan asked, watching the water catch the late afternoon light, whether Earl Webb Lake would always carry our family's name now, and I told him, names fade eventually, son, but truth, once it's out, tends to stick around. Renee leaned against my shoulder, and for the first time in over a year, none of us were thinking about lawsuits, surveys, or stolen reserves, just the quiet, steady sound of water doing exactly what it was always meant to do. I turned the wheel one final, gentle quarter turn, just enough to hear the old mechanism settle into place, and walked back toward my family, knowing the land, the lake, and the truth were finally, fully ours again. The END.